to Employment Bites. In this series, our London employment team provide bite-sized overviews of some of the key developments surrounding the employment law landscape in the UK. Whether you're an employer or employee, join us for a discussion navigating the dynamic world of employment law. I'm Anvita Sharma, and I'm joined today by Kathy Savage. Today, we're going to explore what some of the political parties have said about their priorities for employment law after the general election on the 4th of July. In this episode, we will be concentrating on the implications of the Labour Party's Delivering a New Deal for Working People document, which is normally referred to as the New Deal. We'll also take a quick look at what another Conservative government might mean for employers and employees. Kathy, starting with the New Deal, it describes itself as the biggest upgrade to rights at work for a generation. Do you agree?
It certainly has the potential to be that, depending on how much of it actually goes ahead. We're going to be talking about some of the proposals in a bit more detail shortly, but taken as a whole, it affects almost every area of employment law. There'd been speculation that Labour was going to water down its original 2021 proposals, and that has happened a bit, but overall it would still represent a significant reform package. Short term, employers will probably focus on changes to individual rights, such as unfair dismissal and family-friendly entitlements. But longer term, the emphasis on trade unions and their role in representing employees will be just as significant.
Thanks, Kathy. That's really interesting. And you've talked about short-term and long-term impact. When do you think any reforms are likely to take effect?
So the Labour Party still wants to produce an employment bill within 100 days of taking office if they do win the election. However, they've also said that they're going to consult fully with businesses, workers and civil society. So that suggests we might see a draft bill quite quickly, but that it will take a bit longer to finalise the proposals. It's also not entirely clear how many of the proposals will make it into that employment bill. For example, an early proposal was to abolish the distinction between workers and employees and just have a single status of worker with full employment rights. If you weren't a worker, you'd be genuinely self-employed. But making that change would be quite a complex exercise, and there'd need to be a full and detailed consultation on it, so that might not be included in the initial legislation. And there's also going to be a review of the parental leave framework in the first year of a Labour government, so that's unlikely to get into the first cut of the legislation either. But looking at some of the areas that are likely to feature in the first stage, what would you pick out as the key points for employers, Anvita?
Well, I think all employers are going to be affected by the promise to make basic individual employment protections a day one right. Making unfair dismissal a day one right is a big shift. Even in the last Labour government, you still needed a year's service before you could present an unfair dismissal claim.
So does that mean it's going to be much harder to dismiss a new hire that doesn't work out?
Yes, at least in theory it does. The paper does say that employers can operate probationary periods to assess new hires. That's not that helpful because a contractual probationary period doesn't mean someone can't claim unfair dismissal, but it may indicate that the process an employer has to follow to dismiss someone fairly for failing the probationary period won't be quite as onerous or time-consuming as a normal performance management process, for example. The devil is always going to be in the detail, but the New Deal seems to at least recognise that there's a degree of tension between giving day one rights and encouraging employers to hire staff.
While we're talking about individual rights, tribunal time limits are going to change as well, aren't they?
That's right. As most viewers will know, at the moment, most claims have to be presented within 3 months of the act complained of. That will increase to 6 months under Labour's proposals. So this could mean that employers face more claims, especially if unfair dismissal is a day one right. So that would be my tip of what to look out for. What would you highlight as other significant changes, Kathy?
There's a focus on additional family-friendly rights in addition to the parental leave review. So that includes a new right to bereavement leave, requiring employers to have a menopause action policy, stopping employers from dismissing employees who have recently returned from maternity leave, and also considering paid carers leave. Flexible working would also become a genuine default, apparently, although there's no detail in the paper about what further changes would be needed to make that happen. Apart from family-friendly proposals, the national minimum wage would apply to all those aged 18 and over and getting rid of the existing age bands, and unpaid internships would be banned to try and promote greater social mobility. And then finally, on the D&I front, it would become mandatory for employers with 250 or more staff to report on their ethnicity and disability pay gaps and to prepare action plans to tackle their gender pay gaps. There's also a suggestion that it might become easier to enforce equal pay rights, although there's nothing concrete about how a proposed regulatory and enforcement unit for equal pay might work.
Two areas that have been controversial in recent years are zero-hour contracts and fire and rehire. What does the New Deal say about those?
So these are two areas that do seem to have been watered down, at least a bit. Originally, Labour had said it was going to ban zero-hour contracts, and it would prevent employers from dismissing and re-engaging employees. But now 0 hours will still be permitted for those who want them, but those who don't will be able to have a contract reflecting their average hours over a 12-week reference period. And that appears to be a right to demand, not a simple right to request of the sort passed earlier this year, but not yet in force. And there's a grudging recognition that fire and rehire might still be necessary if the viability of the business is at stake, for example. But we don't know how high that threshold is going to be at this stage. A Labour government is still going to be committed to preventing abuse of fire and rehire tactics and would strengthen the code of practice, which was approved just before Parliament was dissolved, and they'd also introduced new remedies for employees. I said earlier that in the longer term, changes to collective rights would be significant for employers. Could you talk us through some of those changes, Anvita?
All employers need to be aware of possible changes to collective redundancy consultation rules. In the future, it seems that collective consultation could be triggered whenever 20 or more employees are being dismissed within a period of 90 days, even if they're not based at the same establishment. This would engage collective consultation obligations in many more cases than at present. Trade unions will also be given a right to access workplaces to recruit and organise members. Employers will have to tell employees that they have a right to join a union in their statement of written particulars and regularly remind them of this. There is also a promise to reduce the thresholds for statutory trade union recognition. For example, a trade union won't have to show that a majority of employers would support a claim for statutory recognition before starting the recognition process. This all suggests that statutory recognition requests will become more common in future, even in private sector organisations without a history of union activity or membership. Some of the recent restrictions on industrial action will also be repealed under Labour's proposals. This includes a minimum turnout requirement for strikes in important public services. It will again be possible to call a strike if a majority of those are voting in favour, regardless of turnout. Kathy, there's a bit of a technology theme running through the paper as well. Could you outline some of these proposals?
So there are a couple of points to talk about here, and the first relates to the right to switch off, which Labour originally said it was going to introduce. It's backtracked slightly though, as it will now be taking an approach similar to that used in Ireland. This depends on a statutory code of practice and requiring employers to have internal policies on the right to disconnect, but it's not a formal legal right. And then the second area is if an employer wants to introduce surveillance technologies, they will have to consult a union or elected employee representatives before doing so. Now that's already fairly common in Europe, but it's a departure from our existing practice in the UK. Those are the main features of the New Deal, but before we close, could you say a few words about any plans the Conservative Party might have for employment law in the future?
Well, we are still waiting for the Conservative manifesto at the time of recording this employment bite, so there aren't any detailed proposals to report. However, a few ideas were outstanding when the general election was called. The government said some time ago that it would limit the duration of non-compete restrictions to 3 months. Now, nothing has happened on that front, but this reform would actually align with new US restrictions on non-competes. So this may be something that progresses post-election if the Conservative Party remains in power. Consultation had also started just before the election was announced on changes to TUPE, although these were more housekeeping points than sweeping changes. The Ministry of Justice had also suggested restrictions on using NDAs in sexual harassment claims. I think it's fair to assume that we are unlikely to see Conservative proposals with anything like the impact of the Labour Party's New Deal, even once we have the manifesto to hand. So that brings us to the end of the employment bite. Now, we haven't mentioned every aspect of Labour's New Deal because we don't have the time, but if we do have a change of government after the election, we will be holding a webinar to discuss the proposed employment bill and its implications in more detail, and we very much look forward to seeing you then.